The QR code shown here links to text references that provide background information for the following lesson. By the middle of the 18th century, Britain's North American colonies had developed into distinct societies with their own economic, religious, and cultural characteristics. When we talk about colonial America, therefore, we should be careful not to imagine one uniform colonial experience, where a person lived, their social class, race, gender, religion, and whether they were free or enslaved all shaped daily life. Traditionally, historians grouped the 13 British colonies into three broad regions: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. New England included Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. The Middle Colonies included New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The Southern Colonies included Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. As we examine colonial life, pay attention to both the differences among these regions and the experiences that increasingly connected them. By 1750, these were still British colonies, but they were also developing institutions and cultural traditions that would influence the society eventually created by the American Revolution. A landscape of religious variety. While some colonies were founded for specific religious groups, the Atlantic world gradually became home to multiple faith traditions. This diversity helped reshape attitudes toward belief and worship, from uniformity to toleration. Early colonial leaders often sought religious conformity, yet practical realities encouraged greater acceptance. Over time, coexistence became necessary for social stability and economic growth. Push factors for migration. Many settlers crossed the Atlantic seeking freedom from religious persecution. Their experiences reinforced the conviction that conscience should not be governed by the state. Seeds of religious freedom. Exposure to different traditions helped cultivate the emerging principle that individuals should have the right to practice their faith without interference, an idea that would later influence American constitutional thought. Religion and community life. Churches, synagogues, and meeting houses were more than places of worship. They served as centers for education, charity, and civic engagement. Tensions remained. Despite movement toward toleration, suspicion and discrimination persisted. Not all groups enjoyed equal acceptance, reminding students that religious liberty developed gradually rather than instantly. Long-term historical significance. Helped establish freedom of conscience as a cultural expectation. Encouraged pluralism within a growing society. Influenced later protections for religious exercise. One of the most important religious developments of the 18th century was the Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies during the 1730s, 1740s, and into the 1750s. One of its best-known figures was Jonathan Edwards, whose famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," illustrates the intensely emotional style associated with revival preaching. Edwards wanted people to do more than simply belong to a church. He emphasized personal conversion and an individual's direct relationship with God. This is where the Great Awakening becomes significant beyond religious history. Revivalism encouraged ordinary people to evaluate religious authority for themselves. People could decide which ministers they wanted to hear and whether established religious leaders were adequately meeting their spiritual needs. The revivals actually created divisions between supporters, sometimes called New Lights, and defenders of more traditional religious practices, known as Old Lights. There were also unintended political consequences. The Great Awakening did not cause the American Revolution, but it contributed to a culture in which ordinary people became more comfortable questioning established authority. That habit of asking, "Why should I accept an authority simply because it is established?" would become increasingly important as colonial Americans began questioning British political authority. The family was one of the most important institutions in colonial America. We tend today to separate home life from work, education, and economic activity. Colonial Americans generally could not make those distinctions so easily. The household was simultaneously a family unit, an economic unit, and often an educational unit. Colonial families were generally hierarchical. Fathers were legally and socially recognized as heads of households, while women carried enormous responsibility for maintaining those households. Women raised children, prepared food, produced clothing and other household goods, and frequently participated directly in family businesses and agricultural production. Their political and legal rights were limited, but their economic contributions were indispensable. Childhood was also different from our modern understanding. Children were expected to prepare for adult responsibilities relatively early. Boys might learn farming or a trade from their fathers or through apprenticeships, while girls learned skills associated with household management and family production. Family life also differed regionally. New England's settlement patterns encouraged relatively compact communities, while plantation agriculture in the South contributed to greater economic inequality and a more visibly stratified social structure. The family, therefore, became one of the principal institutions through which colonial Americans transmitted ideas about authority, work, property, religion, and social responsibility from one generation to another. Education provides another example of significant regional variation. New England was the first colonial region to establish common schools, partly because its religious culture placed such a strong emphasis on literacy. If individuals were expected to read and understand the Bible, they obviously had to be able to read. Some of America's oldest institutions of higher education also emerged during the colonial period. Harvard and Yale were established in New England, William and Mary in Virginia, and the College of Philadelphia, later the University of Pennsylvania, in the Middle Colonies. But educational opportunity was far from equal. Boys generally had greater access to formal education than girls, while enslaved people faced severe restrictions on education. Increasing literacy nevertheless had consequences that went beyond religion. Literate colonists could read newspapers, pamphlets, political arguments, scientific writings, and philosophical works arriving from elsewhere in the Atlantic world. That becomes especially important when we approach the Revolutionary period. A population accustomed to reading, debating, and exchanging ideas was increasingly capable of participating in discussions about government and political authority. Colonial education therefore helped create some of the intellectual conditions that later supported demands for self-government. Colonial America was also part of a much larger intellectual transformation occurring throughout the Atlantic world. The scientific revolution encouraged people to rely increasingly upon observation, experimentation, measurement, and evidence when trying to understand the natural world. Notice the larger pattern developing here. In religion, people were increasingly encouraged to examine their own spiritual experiences. In education, greater literacy exposed colonists to new ideas. Science encouraged individuals to question explanations based solely upon tradition and authority. Several figures became associated with scientific and intellectual life in colonial America, including Benjamin Franklin, David Rittenhouse, John Bartram, Benjamin Rush, and Benjamin Banneker. Franklin is particularly useful because he demonstrates how closely scientific inquiry and Enlightenment thought could intersect. Scientific experimentation suggested that human beings could. At this point, however, we have to confront one of the great contradictions of colonial American history. We have discussed religious freedom, literacy, scientific inquiry, individual conscience, and the questioning of traditional authority. At precisely the same time that these ideas were developing, racial slavery was becoming deeply embedded in colonial society. Slavery was not peripheral to colonial America, nor was it simply a Southern phenomenon. Its size, economic function, and characteristics differed considerably by region, but enslaved labor existed throughout British North America. As we move through the next several slides, pay particular attention to those regional differences. The plantation slavery of the southern colonies did not look exactly like slavery in New York or Massachusetts. But different forms of slavery were connected through the larger Atlantic economy. This produces a fundamental historical question that will follow us through the colonial and revolutionary eras. How could a society increasingly interested in liberty simultaneously expand a system that denied liberty to others? Slavery became especially important to the economy and social structure of the southern colonies. By the 18th century, plantation agriculture depended heavily upon enslaved African labor, particularly in areas producing labor-intensive cash crops such as rice and indigo. It is important, however, not to describe enslaved Africans simply as labor. They brought knowledge with them. African expertise, particularly knowledge associated with rice cultivation, contributed significantly to the profitability of plantation agriculture. Slavery also shaped Southern society politically and socially. Wealth and land increasingly became concentrated among slaveholding elites, producing a highly stratified society in which economic inequality became intertwined with racial hierarchy. At the same time, enslaved people were never simply passive victims of the institution. They demonstrated agency in numerous ways. Resistance could include open rebellion, but it could also take less dramatic forms. Maintaining family relationships. The Middle Colonies remind us why it is historically inaccurate to describe slavery exclusively as a Southern institution. The economy here differed substantially from the plantation South. Cities such as New York developed into important commercial centers, while smaller farms, ports, workshops, and merchant enterprises provided different kinds of employment for enslaved laborers. Consequently, slavery could have a much more urban and commercial character. Enslaved people worked in households, artisan shops, docks, businesses, and agricultural settings. The Middle Colonies were also deeply connected to the Atlantic economy. Merchants could profit from systems of slavery even when they did not personally own large plantations. Shipping, financing, trade, food exports, and the processing and distribution of commodities produced through enslaved labor connected northern commerce to slavery throughout the Atlantic world. This distinction is important. The absence of a plantation does not mean the absence of slavery or economic involvement with slavery. The Middle Colonies could therefore simultaneously exhibit remarkable ethnic and religious diversity while maintaining racial inequality and systems of unfree labor. Colonial America's economic connections to slavery were much broader than the plantation South alone. Finally, we come to New England. Compared with the plantation South, the enslaved population was generally smaller, and the region's geography and economy did not encourage the same large-scale cash crop plantation system. But smaller numbers should not be confused with absence. Slavery was legal and practiced in New England. Enslaved people worked in households, on farms, at ports, and in workshops. New England commerce was also connected to the broader Atlantic economy. Massachusetts offers an especially interesting example of the contradiction between slavery and emerging ideas about liberty. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties of 1641 formally recognized circumstances under which slavery could legally exist. By the late 18th century, however, the language of natural rights was increasingly being turned against slavery itself. Legal challenges used principles articulated in the new Massachusetts Constitution to argue that slavery was incompatible with claims about human equality and liberty. One figure worth remembering is Lemuel Haynes. Born in Connecticut in 1753, Haynes served during the American Revolution and later became the first African-American ordained minister in the United States. His writings challenged Americans to confront the inconsistency between their political principles and slavery. His argument represents a question African Americans would repeatedly pose throughout American history. If American ideals of liberty and equality are truly universal, why shouldn't they apply to us? Taken together, these topics reveal colonial America as a society filled with both development and contradiction. Religion encouraged both conformity and freedom of conscience. Education reinforced traditional values while giving people intellectual tools to challenge authority. Science elevated reason and inquiry. Families maintained established hierarchies while forming the economic foundation of society. And throughout the colonies, Americans increasingly discussed liberty while participating in an economic system deeply connected to human bondage. Those contradictions matter because they help us understand what happens next. The generation that eventually challenges British authority did not suddenly discover ideas about liberty in 1776. Those ideas had been developing through decades of colonial experience. At the same time, the limitations and contradictions within those ideas were already deeply rooted in colonial society. That is the essential bridge from colonial America to revolutionary America. The colonies were becoming increasingly prepared to question authority, but Americans had not yet resolved the question of who was entitled to the liberty they were beginning to demand. This concludes the presentation. Please review relevant text references related to the topics presented in this lesson.